CHÉOS exists to improve health outcomes for BC, Canada, and the world. Learn more at chaos.ubc.ca.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CHÉOS Work in Progress series. We recognize with gratitude that we are on native land as we gather today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I am happy today to introduce Dr. Josie Geller. Dr. Geller is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UBC and the director of research at the Provincial Adult Tertiary Specialized Eating Disorders Program here at St. Paul's Hospital. The primary focus of her clinical research is patient-centered, collaborative care that promotes client autonomy, well-being, and best outcomes. She's interested in client readiness and motivation, therapeutic alliance, and self-compassion. While Dr. Geller's work has focused primarily on the assessment and treatment of individuals with eating disorders, her clinical and research interests have been applied to other populations, including HIV, substance use, and obesity. She is widely published and an internationally renowned speaker, so we are thrilled to have her here today.
Hi, everyone. Well, what a pleasure it is to present to this group. I feel like it's been a long time, and I don't know if you're the same, but if it happened pre-pandemic, I have no perspective of when it happened. But yeah, what I was hoping to do today is tell you about a program of research that me and some of my team of Arna, who's here, have been involved in. We're actually in our final year. It's a Michael Smith Health Professional Investigator Award, and it's exploring the role that self-compassion plays in recovery from an eating disorder. And I'll tell you a bit more about how we got interested in looking not just at the role that it plays in patients' recovery, but also the role that self-compassion plays in our lives as carers, and also family members' lives of people who are supporting somebody who's in recovery from an eating disorder. So I'm really excited to tell you about it. Just to acknowledge with gratitude that we are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, that much of our work takes place across numerous and distinct territories throughout Canada. So what I'd like to do in the talk today is start out by filling you in on how we got interested in self-compassion in the first place. There was kind of already an explosion of research in other areas, but there were some seminal studies that occurred in eating disorders that really piqued our interest, and that set the stage for this program of research. It's kind of fun to be talking about it now because we're literally, what are we, year 4.5 of a 5-year program. So, you know, when you have a chance to step back and start thinking about big picture, I don't think we've done all of that yet, and we're still analyzing a couple of final studies. But it's nice to have this bigger picture perspective of the work that we've been completely immersed in for the last several years. So after providing an introduction to self-compassion and how we got interested in it, I'd like to tell you about some of the specific research that we did where we solicited the voices of patients or individuals with lived experiences. I am a quantitative research by trade. If you had talked to me 5 years ago, I would have said, qualitative, stay away from me. I like numbers and stats. But actually in the course of this research, we've ended up doing 2 fairly large qualitative projects. And because it was an area that we had more questions and they were more open-ended, it seemed like a qualitative methodology really lent itself to that. And I have to say I'm kind of converted. And not only by the process of doing qualitative research, but also to having individuals with lived experience involved in our research. And so one of our qualitative studies actually led to the creation of some videos of some of the participants in that study. And I have to tell you, they're like magic when I show them to current patients, also for teaching purposes. You know, that it turns out that people find it a lot more credible not to listen to what I have to say, but to what somebody who was in their shoes not that long ago has to say. So we tried out the technology. It looks like it works, and I'll show you a little excerpt of one of those videos today just to give you a flavor of what we're doing and what we have plans to do more of in the course of finishing up this grant. And then we're going to move to the role of self-compassion in us as clinicians. Is there any benefit to us practicing self-compassion? And I'll link that into some previous work that we were doing on collaborative care, which has been a pet interest of mine for a long time, about the nature of relationships that we have in clinical psych with our patients. So not just what we do, but how we do it, and how compassion and self-compassion may be involved in that. And then I'll finish up by telling you about some upcoming projects, some of which will be part of this grant and some of which will be projects that we'll be seeking funding for in the future. So hopefully that will be of interest to you guys, and will take us about the time that we have allotted for today. And I understand we're going to leave all questions till the end. Yeah, perfect. So why did we get interested in self-compassion in the first place? I'm actually curious because I'm so used to talking mostly to mental health practitioners. In this room, how many of you have heard of the topic self-compassion and have a general sense, like, you know what we're talking about? So it's like so mainstream, right? It's not, and I'm going to ask you, because I always worry when I come to CHÉOS, well, those guys are like really, you know, research, scientific people. They're going to think this research is woo-woo. How many of you think that self-compassion is woo-woo? You can be honest. You're either being very kind. For those who are not in the room, no hands went up. So this is probably review for most of you. There are two main definitions of self-compassion that are relevant in the literature that we've been reviewing, because they've come up with empirical measures where we've been able to quantify it and look at how it's related to other variables of interest. Kristen Neff is the one who sort of broke the idea. She's more of a social psychologist. She describes self-compassion as having three components: of being open to the present moment, a kind of mindfulness, recognizing our common human experiences, she calls that common humanity, and cultivating caring and kindness towards our inadequacies. She really talks about self-compassion coming to life, not in good times when things are going well, but when we're experiencing hardship, the way we relate to ourselves in times of difficulty. Another researcher, Paul Gilbert, has come at compassion and self-compassion more from a clinical perspective. And he started working in the area after working with people who had high levels of depression and trauma and shame. And his angle is a little bit more clinical, and I really find it useful to incorporate the two definitions. He sees compassion simply as a sensitivity to suffering with a deep commitment to try and relieve it. And what he's really emphasizing more as time goes on is the motivational component of self-compassion. And this is really interesting to me because in eating disorders, motivation plays an important role in recovery, as it does with addictions. And Paul's way of thinking about it, Paul Gilbert's way, is that it's not just a thing, it's an approach to a thing. It's how motivated we are to relate to ourselves in a kind way. And you'll see that this will become relevant when I start to tell you about self-compassion and the barriers that come up in our populations. That very often, when I first introduce the concept, they're telling me they are not motivated to practice self-compassion. And I'll tell you about some of the reasons that they say that. But just to take compassion to self-compassion for Paul Gilbert, you know, if you add the self-compassion component, it's simply a sensitivity to our own suffering, a willingness to feel our own suffering with that same deep commitment to try and relieve it. And one of the really important findings that we found in people who have eating disorders is that it is far easier for them to have a commitment, aspiration to relieve suffering in other people, and a whole different situation when they're thinking about relieving their own suffering. In fact, very often we've had to start, because it's so challenging for them to even consider practicing compassion for themselves. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, that we actually start just on practicing it with others. Paul Gilbert's work and some of the neuropsych work has shown that the brain centers that light up and that are activated when practicing compassion for others are actually the same centers that light up when practicing it for ourselves. And so it's actually considered like going to the gym and exercising self-compassion muscles. And there is benefit in starting really wherever we can get those parts of our body activated. That'll come up a little bit more later. Just to summarize the two and to put Neff and Gilbert together, they really do have more overlap than differences. They both refer to mindfulness, or Paul would call it a courage to feel. So Kristen Neff would say it's just, the capacity to be tuned into our present moment experience. Paul would say that it involves some courage. You can see his way of thinking that there's that motivational component. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like in real life, if we're not being mindful, we might have something difficult happen to us and we think this shouldn't be happening. And we have thoughts that feed into that belief, and we have an escalation of feelings. And sometimes once the ball gets rolling, we're feeling even more distressed. And so if we were practicing self-compassion, we would relate to the difficult experience by tuning into what's going on in our bodies and just note what the experience is. So it might be, I feel self-doubt or frustration or fear, and my feelings are okay. They're just feelings. So it's just a willingness to pay attention rather than either run away from or ignore. So that's the first component. The second is this common humanity. That's what Kristen Neff would call it, or Gilbert would call it an acceptance or a wisdom of the experience. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So if we were not practicing self-compassion, something difficult has happened, we might think, oh my gosh, I'm the only one who's having these problems, or I'm a loser, or I'm the only person that's going through this. Will this ever end? Or, I feel alone. Those are some of the things people might think. And if we were to apply common humanity or wisdom, when I teach our patients this, I'll just use the word contextualize. And it could be contextualizing it, that I am one of many humans who all feel inadequate. We can all be hard on ourselves. We all have experiences of failure. I'm not alone when I'm having a difficult time. In fact, it's an opportunity to connect with people and the inadequacies and difficulties that are common to being human. And we can also contextualize over time. Sometimes I'll get our patients to think about a time that they were on their knees, that it was one of the worst moments of their lives, and to remember that that moment actually ended, that the feelings that they experienced in that moment, that they may have felt, this is never going to end, it's always going to be like this. Actually, they had moments of joy and love and gratitude after that. And so just a reminder that our feelings are moving targets. And one of the things that we also talk about that I find very helpful is that, I don't know if you know this, the life expectancy of a feeling that isn't fed by thought. So that's the key piece. Once we feed it by thought, the life expectancy changes. But if we have the courage to simply experience the feeling and tune into the sensation of the feeling, we're looking at 90 seconds. And that can be quite uplifting when we're in our lowest of lows, that if we can find a way to stay tuned in and mindful to the experience, that they tend to be like clouds passing in the sky. And before you know it, we're going to be feeling something else. So the second component of self-compassion is that willingness to feel, to recognize that we're not alone amongst other people, and that it's something that will change over time. It's not always going to be like this. And then the third component is the one that probably people think of the most, is just this self-kindness, or Paul would say a commitment to help. And this is where that real motivational component also comes into play. So rather than say, something judgmental about ourselves, like I'm doing a lousy job, if we're practicing self-compassion, we would just be in touch with our aspiration to be kind to ourselves in this moment of suffering or difficulty. And then that motivational component of what could I do that serves? If I'm feeling enraged, what do I need? Very often I need to feel validated, or I need to, punch a pillow, or, what do I need when I'm feeling sad? I need comfort, just to have an aspiration of, even if I don't know what it is, we'll often teach this, that just having the aspiration to relieve myself of these difficult feelings is helpful. So that's the last component. Why do we care about self-compassion? Well, it's not our research. There's literally been an explosion over the past couple of decades that any mental health variable that you can think of is associated with self-compassion. It's almost synonymous, in fact, with good mental health. It's associated with resilience to negative feedback. These are just a very small sampling of some of the data that's out there. People are less upset by challenging situations. Really nice qualities like being more likely to admit and learn from mistakes. People who have high self-compassion report less anger, they have better relationships, and in the physical and mental health fields, it's quite relevant that they do better in response to treatment, whether it's diabetes or cardiac issues or depression and anxiety, that people really benefit from self-compassion. It became really interesting in the field of eating disorders when some researchers back about 15 years ago in 2007 used a paradigm that you guys probably wouldn't be familiar with this, but you'll be able to guess how it works, where they applied self-compassion, where they added self-compassion to a very common research design or research paradigm that I'll just take you through because I think it's kind of fun. You know what I mean if I say a chronic dieter. A chronic dieter is someone who would describe themselves as always cutting back what they're eating. They would tend to classify foods as either good foods or bad foods. And they would tend to say, you know, I only eat these kinds of foods and I never eat these kinds of foods. They're sometimes characterized as being yo-yo dieters. They're prone to cyclical patterns of, you know, having periods that they're quite restrictive and then patterns that they eat significantly more. So why are we interested in them? If we think about chronic dieters and non-dieters, non-dieters will tend to eat a range of foods, including delicious things like chocolate chip cookies. Whereas chronic dieters would typically say, that's not a food that I would incorporate in my normal day-to-day eating. So what do? It's actually kind of a sneaky paradigm. It's kind of fun, or sneaky, depending on how you want to think about it. What they do is they take individuals who are chronic dieters as well as people who are not dieters, and they bring them into a research study situation where they have them complete a bunch of questionnaires. Some of them are asked to drink a milkshake, and some of them do not drink a milkshake. What they do is they pretend that the study is then over. You've come in, you've done a bunch of questionnaires, some of them get milkshakes, some of them don't get milkshakes. Then the sneaky part is they say, oh, by the way, we've got this other research study going on over here. It's a taste test. You know, do you mind going over here? We've got like 3 different types of cookies or donuts or whatever it is. We'd just like you to taste them and give us a rating on, you know, how tasty you think each of them are. The sneaky experimenters then leave the room and leave the individual alone in the room with the cookies, and they can eat as much as they want. And afterwards, they weigh the cookie trays so you can actually quantify how much they tasted. You get the idea? Okay. So let's see if you can guess what happens if you bring non-dieters. So these are individuals who allow themselves to eat freely different types of foods, and they have a milkshake. If a non-dieter has had a milkshake, do they eat more cookies or less cookies in the taste test than non-dieters who haven't had a milkshake? If you've had the milkshake, are you going to eat more cookies or less cookies if you're just sort of like, yeah, they feel more full, so they consume less cookies than if they hadn't had the milkshake, right? Because they're just responding to hunger and satiety cues. Okay, what do you think happens for chronic dieters? If chronic dieters have had a milkshake, do they eat more cookies or less cookies than if they hadn't had the milkshake? See, you guys know this study. What we see is they actually have what we would call a binge. So they eat a larger quantity of cookies. And this has been labeled, this is a very old paradigm, but it's one that we're quite familiar with. We call it the disinhibition effect. It's basically coming from the thinking, which is, I've already failed, I've already blown it, I had this, you know, this milkshake, I wasn't supposed to have that, so I may as well just go, you know, and eat lots of cookies. I may as well binge. Okay. So why is this relevant to self-compassion? Because fast forward to 2007, and some great researchers, Adams and Leary, simply took individuals who are chronic dieters. So they didn't include non-dieters in this study, and everybody got a milkshake. So we already know what happens in general with people who are chronic dieters and who get the milkshake, and then we put them into the taste test. But now they randomly assigned them to one of 2 conditions. One condition just went straight from the milkshake to the taste test, the way the previous paradigm went. And the other group received a very brief self-compassion intervention, which had the components in Kristen Neff's definition of kindness, shared humanity, and mindfulness. And it's so minor, you're going to laugh at how little it is. But basically, after they had the milkshake and thought they had completed the first arm of the study, somebody took them aside and said, hey, I hope you won't be hard on yourself. You know, everybody eats unhealthily sometimes, and everyone in the study eats this stuff, common humanity. This little amount of food doesn't matter anyway. So just hitting on the three components of, mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness, very simple. And then the groups were put into the same situation with the cookies. And what happened was that those who had received that very minor intervention, it basically attenuated the binge. That just those, that simple guidance and reference to those three components of self-compassion was enough for them to look more like the non-dieters when they were put into the taste test. So that was kind of what piqued our interest when this study came out. And, we hadn't looked at self-compassion so much in the eating disorders, but that kind of got the ball rolling for us to think about what relevance might it have in recovery. These are people who didn't have bona fide eating disorders, who just had, a tendency to be chronic dieters. And so that got us and a few other people interested in, what role does self-compassion have in recovery? And this was, I'm putting this because this takes us back to the first time that we put self-compassion into one of our research packages. And these are all of the variables that we typically have in our CQI, our continuous quality improvement packages, drive for thinness, by dissatisfaction, ineffectiveness, depression, and so on. These are the things that we're interested in seeing improvements in the course of the treatment programs that we have here at PATSED. And what we found was like crazy high significant correlations with self-compassion, that people who have eating disorder, it was almost like having low self-compassion was synonymous with the collection of symptoms that are associated with an eating disorder. Like they were that high, the correlations. So that was the first clue that maybe there was something worth investigating. And then the other was so we were very lucky here in the program that we have, in fact, Avarna is involved in it. All of the patients who come either to our inpatient unit or to our residential treatment program complete a battery of measures at pre-treatment, post-treatment, and follow-up. And in their exit questionnaires, they have an opportunity to tell us about, what parts of the program were most helpful for them. And we were consistently seeing something like, that the cultivating self-compassion was one of the most important parts of recovery for people who went into our residential treatment program, which is a 12 to 15 week, they sort of come out looking pretty darn good. If they can stick it out in that program, they look, certainly behaviorally recovered by the time they're finished. So those two things together made us think that, there may very well be an important role for self-compassion for people who have eating disorders. And we started to look at it more. I think that's about when we got the funding. And this is what we found. People who have eating disorders have barriers to self-compassion, that it's not a no-brainer for them to think that this is something that is going to be that they would want to incorporate into their lives. I remember when we did a focus group initially and I asked them about self-compassion, one person literally said this. And when I asked her why, she said she felt that if she were to practice self-compassion, she would have to give up her eating disorder. And as we know, and as our research used to look at this issue of readiness for people who were not ready to make changes, the idea of drinking the Kool-Aid or taking on something that might make it impossible to have an eating disorder was not that appealing. So we want to learn more about barriers, and we were very lucky because Paul Gilbert, brilliant guy, had come up with a measure of fears of compassion. And you probably can't read these, and don't worry about it. I'm going to tell you what happened. When we gave this measure, all different types of fears of self-compassion to people who have eating disorders, and subjected it to a factor analysis to see, are there any trends, is there anything that we can learn about the types of barriers that people with eating disorders might have? There are no trends in non-clinical populations. It's just sort of like an amorphous, lots of different reasons that I might not want to practice self-compassion. But we actually got a very distinct two-factor structure for fears of compassion. And I'll tell you what they were. The first one we labeled meeting standards. And this was, I'm worried that if I practice self-compassion, what our patients would say colloquially, I'm going to get lazy and fat and no one's going to love me. The idea being that I have to be hard on myself in order to have drive and to achieve and to basically get the things that I want in life. So the type of items that loaded onto the meeting standards factor were, I fear that if I become too compassionate, I'll lose my self-criticism and my flaws will show, or people will reject me, and this was really important with the meeting standards factor, it had to do with identity. I will become somebody that I don't want to be. So that was one factor. And the fears of compassion in our group were also significantly elevated relative to a non-eating disorder population or individuals who don't have eating disorders. The second factor we called emotional vulnerability. And this is a combination of things, but mostly feeling undeserving of self-compassion or being concerned that if I had self-compassion, I'm going to have feelings that I will be overwhelmed by. Or, and this is also fairly common, having no experience, no clue really what it means to practice self-compassion. Like it's such a foreign concept that it's hard to relate to it. So examples on the measure were, I don't deserve it. I feel like it'll be overwhelming. I'm going to have feelings of sadness, emptiness. I'm going to be overcome with loss or grief. Some patients say, if I allow myself to have self-compassion now, it kind of shines a light on all the years of my life that I haven't practiced self-compassion and how sad that is. Or it might shine a light on some very uncompassionate things that have happened to me in my life, or responses to other people. So there's some loss and grief that might come up. And then the last one is more this idea of like, I don't even know where to begin. This is a total foreign concept. It's not something I was raised in. I thought you were supposed to be tough on yourself and hard driving, and and that's what you need to do in life. So we had these two factors, and I've always been interested in how do we make the treatment that we offer here at St. Paul's. We're very lucky. Both our residential and inpatient units are, I do a lot of traveling around different programs, and they're really second to none. They're great programs. And we're very lucky we have staff who are committed to always trying to figure out how can we do better. And we learned about 20 years ago that if we could be very attentive and tuned in to readiness issues, because so many of the people who we see are ambivalent about making changes. And if we use a way of working with them where we're not forcing them to do something until they've decided for themselves that that's something that they think would be helpful, we significantly improved our outcomes, reduced our dropout rates, and created a better clinical environment for everybody. I was interested in knowing whether there's anything about the degree to which people come to our programs with self-compassion or with barriers to self-compassion, whether that might also tell us something about how much they're going to benefit from treatment. Is this something that would be useful for us to be addressing in our clinical programs? So we measured self-compassion and barriers to self-compassion at baseline before going into either of our treatments, our inpatient unit or our residential treatment program, to see if any of those were associated with how much our patients actually benefit from treatment. And this is part of this program of research that we're doing now. It turns out that both of these barriers were consistently and significantly related to outcome, both meeting standards barriers, which is that idea that, if I practice self-compassion, I'm going to become a lazy, fat person who doesn't achieve anything, as well as the emotional vulnerability. I'm going to be overwhelmed, I'm not deserving, or I have no experience with this. So in other words, the extent to which folks who are coming to our treatment saying, I have a lot of concerns about practicing self-compassion, that those individuals benefit less than individuals who have more openness to practicing self-compassion. And because of that, it made me think, well, we need to figure out how to reduce barriers. And it relates to a lot of things that we've been looking at anyhow. I'm interested in motivation. And it started to smell a little bit like this is kind of motivational. It's like, I'm not ready for self-compassion, like I'm not really open. Interestingly, self-compassion itself was not a predictor of how much people benefited. It was barriers to self-compassion, which to me felt motivational. And that's when I took the step out of my comfort zone of quantitative research and took a step into qualitative, because it just felt like we didn't know enough to know what are these barriers and what kinds of things are helpful to people in overcoming them. And so that led to our first qualitative project, where we invited people who were either fully recovered or were really far along in their recovery journey to tell us about their experiences with self-compassion. And we learned about the components that came together for their recovery journey, but we also were really interested in knowing what helped. If you started feeling like you were not receptive to the idea of self-compassion and then became more receptive, that the barriers went down, what helped? What did anybody do or anybody say or anything in your environment that actually helped those barriers to come down? So that was basically the question. What did others do that helped you overcome barriers to self-compassion? And this was actually the unexpected. When you do qualitative research and you have like one question that you think you're doing the research about, and that turns out to be okay, but kind of boring. And then there's something else that comes out that you didn't expect to look at. That was the way this project was for me. This was by far, what did others do that helped? I thought was a lot more interesting and original, because you could summarize the findings with one word, which would be validation. And so what does that mean? There were 4 ways in which they described validation contributed to their ability to overcome barriers to self-compassion. And I've probably gotten more mileage out of this study. And I think we have more patients in our program who have explicitly asked for this study and who have then circulated it to their family members, who they really felt a need to share this with. There's something about this story that they told us that seems to really get at the heart of their recovery journey and their ability to practice self-compassion. So what do they mean when they say validation? At the very basic level, it was somebody making time and space for them. So open-ended, curious, no assumptions, non-judgmental perspective, and also offering a compassionate perspective to their story, to whatever it is that's going on for them. And what they told us was when they experienced this at, entry level, when they're just starting to tell their story about what's happening with their eating and maybe some of the things that have been painful for them, if they had that sort of environment, space and a compassionate perspective, that they associated that individual with trust, and it made them feel like they could go to the next level. The next level was when they felt that somebody actually understood and recognized what their needs were. So in eating disorder, it's really common for our patients to say that they have people who are pushing them into treatment before they're actually feeling ready, or sometimes not noticing that they actually are really needing help and not offering treatment when they actually want it. So they felt that when somebody was hearing them and was responsive to where they were at and offering suggestions that were tuned in to where they were at, it was really powerful. It was kind of like somebody who was dialed into their readiness. And when someone was dialed into their readiness, they felt cared for, which set them up for the next level. So when people are a little further on in their recovery journey and now they're like doing the work, maybe they're normalizing their eating if they've been underweight or trying to stop binging and purging behaviors. And very often at that point in recovery, loved ones and clinicians are often getting sort of saying, great, we don't need to worry about them anymore. They're on their way. But from their perspective, they're often feeling, whoa, this is like, now I'm doing the hard stuff. I don't have my safety behaviors. They're often suffering more than ever at that time. They are saying that it's really helpful for someone to see and recognize that they're actually working really hard, that this is difficult, and also to remind them of other things that they've done where they were able to overcome difficulties. So basically, things that show them that they can do this. So when they're in the hard work, not to kind of say, good, we don't have to worry about you anymore, but actually who recognize how difficult it is. And that made them feel empowered. And then the last finding is the one that I found most fun. And I thought the patients who participated in this project were so creative. We call it the walking the runway finding. They're saying it's not enough for you to tell me that I should practice self-compassion. Show me that you practice it. You don't have to tell me your whole life story, but show me that, you know, you're a human with vulnerability and that that you think that there's value to it. And they actually gave us explicit stories where a clinician, you know, talked about getting embarrassed when she fell in the subway station or the SkyTrain station, and how helpful it was to hear her coping with self-compassion. And it also opened the window to the importance of hearing stories and of us not being in a hierarchical relationship, but actually just hearing from someone that they could relate to, which is, and when we walked the runway, the impact that that had on them was to feel inspired. So this, I would say, is the study that has circulated the most in our patients. And I think it's something that I wish for them to receive in all their clinical encounters at St. Paul's. And so we liked it so much, and we heard so much feedback that it's helpful to hear stories from people, that we ended up inviting 3 of the participants in this study to come back and to participate in the creation of videos. And this is part of the intervention that we're developing that will be basically targeting reducing barriers to self-compassion. When I show these videos to our patients, I swear it's like magic. It's like the only time that I don't have to prepare when I'm doing group, because the videos just speak for themselves. And patients oftentimes who beforehand were saying, I'm not into that, you know, you throw this on and they can see like people who are in the program and who are, you know, were in their shoes and not that long ago, and it really seems to get their attention. So we're in the video making business now, and we're going to be making some more pretty soon. Just watching the time, so the last thing I wanted to tell you about was the role that compassion has in our own lives as clinicians. And this is in the context of work that we've been doing for a long time, over 20 years, I would say, on collaborative care. Because of the readiness issues that exist for people who have eating disorders, probably not uncommon to substance use and the ambivalence, I would say it's not what we do, but how we do it that probably matters a lot more. And over the years, we've done a number of projects that has attempted to operationalize what does this, you know, the quality of the way we offer care, what does it look like? And basically there's 4 components of, as clinicians, not having assumptions, so that big open curiosity, acceptance, having an aspiration to help with what matters to them, not just to us. Always maximizing autonomy so they don't feel like things aren't being done to them, that they always get to have choices. And we're showing caring that isn't contingent upon the patient's behavior. So it's not, I like you when you're like changing, but you know, I'm not really happy with you when you're not. And you probably won't be surprised to hear that lots of research now has shown that those 4 components, if we ask patients, if we ask family members, if we ask clinicians, what do you think is associated with best outcomes, more acceptable care? There's both survey data as well as looking at actual clinical outcomes that show that using that collaborative stance is associated with better motivation, better support satisfaction, better clinical outcomes. Sadly, there is also, unfortunately, a consistent discrepancy that we find that although it's what we want to be offering as clinicians, very often we're not, that we can be directive and not practice some of the components of collaborative care. And so here we are doing this research on self-compassion. Well, let's see if self-compassion or compassion in clinicians may actually be related to the kind of care that we deliver. And that's how this study came about, was just looking to see whether compassion or self-compassion contributes to collaborative support. And so we looked at 3 variables that all have to do with how clinicians experience themselves, their self-compassion, their compassion for others, and also their just internal distress, like what we're going through as clinicians, which, you know, you can think of how relevant that would be during a pandemic when everyone's feeling a little more depressed and anxious than ordinarily. Do those 3 variables contribute to collaborative support? And what we found was clinician distress was not. And it may be that we were assessing general distress and not situational distress, or it may just be that clinicians are highly trained individuals and are able to set aside their own, internal distress when offering support. But self-compassion and compassion for others both were associated with collaborative support. And when we put them into a regression to see which one matters more, although both of them were contributing factors, it was actually compassion for others that was the strongest determinant of using that nice collaborative support stance. So we'll be following up on this to try and figure out what are the conditions that support clinicians in maintaining their compassion for both for themselves as well as for our patients, and what kind of environment is supportive of that. So I want to leave some time for questions, and I just wanted to finish up by telling you about some of the upcoming projects that we have as we finish up this grant on compassion and self-compassion, and what we're hoping to apply for funding in the future for. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is, I kind of alluded to it, when we created these videos, the idea, overcoming barriers to self-compassion is a whole new thing. There are some interventions that you're probably aware of, either on mindfulness and self-compassion, that are designed to enhance self-compassion. And there are actually some in clinical in clinicians. And apparently the extent to these interventions are associated with reductions in burnout in clinicians, which I think is a really nice step considering what we've all been through over the past few years. And interestingly, one of them that looked at what aspect of the intervention was most helpful for clinicians, that finding was directly related to the extent to which participating in a mindfulness intervention was helpful in reducing burnout to the extent that I had greater feelings of self-compassion. So it wasn't so much my practice of mindfulness, it was the extent to which the practice of mindfulness led to me having more self-compassion that led to reductions in burnout. So we know a little bit about these self-compassion interventions. What we don't know is how do we reduce barriers for people who are actually coming in saying, I'm really not sold on this idea. And that's where the videos came into play, because it seemed like there was something so powerful about hearing the story of someone with lived experience. And our plan, and what I'm doing right now, is just piloting this intervention in the groups that we hold in our residential and inpatient treatment program. But basically, the vision that we have is that for each participant to have a personal self-compassion toolkit by the end of the intervention. And we've learned that it's very individual. What one person needs to overcome their barriers might not be the same as somebody else. So we've got, this combination of having these videos, mindfulness practice, some discussion of barriers, and just lots of practice in general, of letter writing exercises and so on, to see whether at the end of the day, this will create a toolkit for people that they could use when they encounter difficulties in their lives. So stay tuned on this. The plan is by the end of this grant, we'll have the treatment manual developed and we'll apply for funding to test its efficacy. And then the last thing that we're doing is, because we're now sold as qualitative researchers, and because the patients specifically told us that what they need is for carers, so family members and clinicians, to offer validation, we were curious to know, for those individuals who've had a supportive, or whose family has come to be supportive to them, how did the carers get to a point of being able to be validating to their loved ones? Because they often tell us in the beginning that loved ones, understandably, are very scared and distressed about their child's eating disorder, and want to fix it, and very often do everything they can to make it go away. And actually, what the patients are telling us is that what they need more than anything, particularly in cultivating self-compassion, particularly when they're adults, is to be heard, listened to, validated, for there to be responsiveness to their readiness, and a little walking the runway wouldn't hurt either. So what we have just finished doing is we've just finished doing another series of qualitative interviews with parents, and we're still in process of interviewing with partners and husbands and wives, to ask them about what helps them to respond to their loved one with validation. And we're literally just starting the analyses next week. So far, some of the things that are coming up in the interviews that are really interesting are the beliefs that they have about their loved one's support needs. So in the beginning, they really think it's my job to fix it. It's my job to like, get her into treatment or push her to do something. And that belief is going to change for many of them. Also, the value of them telling their story. It's been one of the most impactful experiences for me to hear that. So we have some families, we have what we call the singletons, where it's just one family member who's participating in the research study. But we have a few families where we have more than one informant, where we have a mom and a dad and a husband. And I've been having to debrief these interviews afterwards because honestly, sometimes it's like I'm having 3 completely different stories about what happened, what was helpful, and even like the details of what happened to the loved one with the eating disorder. So there's going to be something for us to learn in that, and particularly the value of telling the story that seems to be so important. And also, what seems to be coming out is that the family members also need to feel validated. You know, they're going through a lot of pain and distress, and they're saying very often so much of their attention is going on the loved one that there isn't a lot left over for their own needs. And I'm finding as an interviewer, I'm just like pulled to provide validation to them because there's really seeming to be thirsty for it and not having a lot of opportunity to receive that. And all of these things together really point to, I think, the role that self-compassion likely plays in the carer's own recovery journey, in their own ability to respond to their distress with kindness and common humanity and mindfulness. So that's where we're at. So I'm going to wrap up, and hopefully we'll have a little time for questions. Basically, people who have eating disorders, it turns out, and I'm guessing that they're probably not that unlike other mental health populations, but they have notoriously low self-compassion and high barriers to self-compassion. That these barriers are predicting poor outcome, and that's what made it such an area of interest for us to understand how do we overcome these barriers. Some of the things that we've learned so far that clinicians can do to help overcome the barriers is to actually practice self-compassion themselves and compassion for others. So not self-compassion for others, compassion for others. And that the more skillful we can become at providing validation, the more useful that we will be to our patients. And that these next steps are, we're looking forward to doing an RCT to evaluate this new intervention that we're developing, and for us to think about, how can we support carers and provide them with an environment where they also get some of their needs met, because they're also feeling a need for support and validation themselves. So I'm going to leave it there and open up for questions if anyone has any. But thanks for your attention.